Welcome. This is going to be a little bit of a preliminary discussion of social contract theory and why we should be moral. I'm Katie Borcoman, your instructor, and I hope in what follows we'll be able to clarify some of the issues that have arisen with respect to the reading of our textbook, Discovering Right and Wrong, by Louis Poyman, the chapter on social contract theory. Amongst the questions we'd want raised here as we read and discuss is, why is the institution of morality justified in the first place? Why should I or you have to do something if it doesn't appear to be in one's own self-interest? That is to say, why should you do something if it's not prudential for you to do it, technically speaking? Why bother at all to be moral anyway? Aren't there advantages to occasionally being immoral and acting unethically and taking advantage of someone else when they least expect it? Another question, of course, that many people ask is, why should I do that? What's in it for me? I certainly can't help but think about that classic movie by starring Humphrey Bogart, Casablanca. Some of you may have seen it. I saw it in its entirety for the first time not too long ago. Claude Rains, Sidney Greenstreet, several other people of notoriety, including Ingrid Bergman, play starring roles in that old 1943 black and white flick that essentially is a morality play and depicts Mr. Bogart in his character of Rick as something of a reluctant, heroic figure. And I think one of the questions that seems to come through that movie when you think about it is that Rick is and his colleagues, at least for a short time, are asking questions such as, what is in it for me? Why should I, let us say, help a couple of people, including a woman who had been a romantic theme for a period of time until he discovered that she was married, and unbeknownst to her, the husband she had, who was a leader of the, you might say, rebellion against the Nazis, he was actually, in fact, alive at the time of which she was carrying on a relationship with Humphrey Bogart, which is also, when you think about it, a theme in and of itself that you could talk about. But he's given an opportunity in the movie to actually do something for the sake of the greater good, and he does embrace it ultimately, although at first his character doesn't seem like it is in keeping with that kind of activity. So I think that would be a good movie amongst others that one could focus on for a little bit. Quite classic. I recommend you take a look at it. What's in it for society? And of course, again, in the movie Casablanca, it seems to be relatively well laid out that ultimately, based upon some of the fictitious elements of that play, if you will, that moral play, there are some benefits to be had for society, and certainly for the escaping Jews and others who are trying to avoid and evade Nazi oppression. So let's talk a little bit about some general answers to questions such as, why does society at all need to have any moral rules? The great philosopher Thomas Hobbes, 1588-1679, thought that human beings always act out of what they perceive to be in their own best interests. So, in other words, at the conscious level, at the very least, a person is likely to do that which he or she will believe to be of some benefit, and there will be some sort of careful, I suppose, qualitative and quantitative evaluation of the perceived benefits. So if a person is engaged in a certain act or has the opportunity to do so, then that individual is going to try to act in such a way as to maximize his or her own self-interest. So there may be a little combo package going on here of a kind of a utilitarianistic egocentrism with respect to what Hobbes is talking about. And it's not clear, by the way, based upon previous discussions we've had and attempting to apply our vocabulary items, whether or not he is an ethical egoist or psychological egoist, or some kind of a combo package of both. There is the ability, of course, to harm and a desire to satisfy our goals, and that can lead to social instability. In other words, human beings, ceteris paribus, all things being equal, have the capacity to harm, and also, if I suppose left unfettered, a desire to satisfy our goals. So it can end up that if there isn't, for example, equality of ability, and some people just happen to have greater intelligence or strength or combination of those things, that they might be somewhat better off, and thus cause certain kinds of harm in a pursuit of their own desire to satisfy their objectives, to others who are less able to actually achieve what they want to. This could be by dint of position in society, in virtue of a lack of willpower or intellect or means or even physical capability. What is described, and of course this is where I suppose it could be some interesting area of controversy, the human state of nature. And according to people like Hobbes, there's no common way of life, no enforced laws, no rules, no justice or injustice. And that state, as far as he is concerned, is one that can be characterized as one of anarchy and chaos. Now think about what that means, anarchy. No rule, no government, chaos, disorder. And try to imagine in your own mind what a state of nature actually would be like. If it could be. If you had a human being that was living in a state of nature, are you really talking about a situation in which you've got several human beings, let us say, on some kind of a isolated island, for the sake of depicting this, who actually have no rules or anything? Now, Lord of the Rings did kind of depict something that degenerated in that kind of a situation, and it is, interesting enough, a bit of a comment or a commentary on how we perceive what human nature truly is like without the added layer, if you will, of culture and convention. According to Hobbes, the state of nature isn't in any individual's best interest, and we all end up being better, he would argue, if we compromise by giving up some of what our natural liberty is. So in a state of nature, let us say, you can imagine a situation in which you're ultimately completely free, because there are no constraints. So, if you put this, I suppose, even in a kind of a Freudian context, you would have a situation in which the id would, in a sense, be able to reign supreme and do whatever the body wanted it to do. And just as long as you're able to get away with it, then you're going to be fine. To me, that's almost like having what is called a lucid dream, which we cannot discuss in great detail here, but a lucid dream is one in which you find yourself in a dream state, actually realizing that you are dreaming and thus have complete control over your environment. There's a little bit of solipsism there, to use some other vocabulary that we have talked about. You were your own self in that dream, and it's not clear that you can do immoral things within a dream situation, but just imagine if you had that kind of control in a physical environment, a waking state, and you'd have some of the things that Hobbes are talking about here. Selfish but rational people are willing to give up some liberty and agree to what is called a social contract, and what the contract does is set up rules and a governing force, and insofar as it does that, supposedly the idea here is that a rational individual is going to realize that they'll have to curtail some of his or her desires, because in the long run it is going to be in their best interest to accomplish most of them, and to have some form of structure supervenient upon the condition of society, such that other people will be prohibited from actually intruding upon your best interests, which is perhaps to say something like life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, things like that has to be curtailed. So Hobbes would go on to say that morality arises from within this contract as a form of social control more than anything else. And without that kind of control, he's certainly famously quoted as having said, life is solitary, poor, brutish, and short, a war of all against all. And while perhaps during the time in which he wrote, life was, in fact, to some extent, significantly shorter on average than it is for today's Western person, certainly in North America and other places in the world. Life is made better, ultimately, because your objectives in large part are going to be achieved, even despite the fact you're going to have to mollify or attenuate some of the drives. I again think that if you think of certain movies that sort of show an attitude towards the natural state of affairs, I have some other presentations, one of which includes the classic movie The Day the Earth Stood Still with Michael Rennie, Patricia Neal. And that one is a bit of a morality play, done in the old-fashioned black and white sci-fi tradition of Hollywood. But among other moral issues that arise in that particular movie, the idea that apparently human beings, including these extraterrestrial beings who set up this robotic police force, have a natural tendency to be somewhat selfish. And if they are not self-limiting, then Klaatu, the alien being in The Day the Earth Stood Still, comes to the fore and visits planet Earth and says, we're not going to allow you to be able to pursue your warlike and violent interests because, in a sense, you are acting irrationally. And, of course, he's talking about an ununited world, probably similar to the world we still have today. We've never managed to have anything like a federation other than perhaps the United Nations, which I suppose at least is a step in the right direction. But he's coming from the point of view that we are not to spread our selfish genes, to use that word figuratively, and promote our own violence and chaos and too much pursuit of individual self-interest. He's not going to allow us to project that into the solar system or the universe at large. Then, of course, there's that Hobbesian morality in the Lord of the Flies, book done by William Golding. And it certainly does portray what could happen if supposedly all the constraints, the strictures, the laws, the regulations are in fact eliminated or not abided by. Golding's view was that we need no external devil to bring about evil, but we have found the devil and he is, as it were, in us, or is us. So, a funny way of looking at it, but again, reflective of this notion that human nature, left unbridled, is almost in a kind of psychoanalytic mode, Freudian. That if we don't have the constraints, let's say they're placed upon us by the superego function, that thing we call the id, which sort of is the symbolic, at least, repository of all the things that we desire to do but normally repress, then that shrinks, that superego, and thus has no further effect upon the id. And I'm using this language simply because I think it is yet another way. There are certainly multiple perspectives on this, but another way of trying to depict this to show you that this view of human nature actually is, rightly or wrongly, negative. But of course it is has visited upon us, upon it, a certain amount of assumptions about what human nature is really like, particularly if it's left in a quote-unquote natural state. There are people who would argue that the natural state is better, by the way. And I'm thinking that people like Henry David Thoreau and Jean-Jacques Rousseau are examples of people who probably believe that to some extent we are made worse because of our exposure to culture, or being enculturated into a world which in fact promotes self-interest, which might be the case, some people would argue, with uncontrolled capitalism. If that sort of world actually makes our molds and mutates and modulates our human nature and makes us actually worse, so that we're not natively evil, we become that way. So there are at least two extremely opposing views on what human nature is. The themes that come through The Lord of the Flies include things like the Hobbesian view that civilization power is weak and vulnerable to primitive explosive passions. Of course, this is really more fodder for psychoanalysis. So, why should we have a social order, and what are the benefits of morality? Well, these things should help keep society from literally falling apart, and I suppose that was a point of showing what was happening when we discussed briefly Lord of the Flies, how things begin to degenerate when there are no social constraints and no obedience to laws and principles. Reduce human suffering. Promote human flourishing. That wonderful word flourishing is a very fine Greek Aristotelian word to mean to flower, to grow. It has an organic connotation associated with it. Resolve conflicts of interest in just and orderly ways. Aside praise and blame, reward and punishment and guilt. So obviously these are all ways that A, promote the best interests of the individual, ideally, and B, prevent the encroachment, presumably, of other entities within a culture or society from impeding one's progress towards full flourishing, just as long, of course, as in the pursuit of one's own flourishing, you're not causing someone else to suffer. So why should you be moral? This infamous or famous, whichever way you want to put it, story of Gyges' ring from Plato's Republic is all about the shepherd that stumbles upon a ring that has magical properties and can make one invisible, allowing a person to escape the restraints or constraints of society. And in this particular case, the shepherd Gyges uses his newfound power to become a king. Now, first of all, for those of you, I suppose, who have watched at some point in time, maybe some of you are aficionados of J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, my guess is, and I've tried to do just a wee bit of research into this, but because he was such a scholar, Tolkien certainly was familiar with Plato, as was C.S. Lewis and some of his other compatriots of the era, and probably would have been very much familiar with this ring, and it could be that indeed is one of the main symbols, metaphors, if you will, in Lord of the Ring trilogy. But remember that the creature Sméagol was completely distorted and corrupted because of his passionate desire for that ring. And then, as you know, Frodo, the Hobbit, occasionally gives in to the temptation to utilize the ring, and certain kinds of things happen to him, befall him. But the ring does seem to, in both instances, symbolize unbridled power. Now, perhaps in a case of Gyges, it was actually utilized for some self-serving purposes that may or may not have had super far-reaching implications for society, but I would imagine that insofar as he used it illegitimately, if you will, to become a king and ascend into that position of power, it seems quite clear that it was an abuse of the power of the ring. And think about it. It must be really, absolutely difficult to resist such a pull. If you had such a ring, Gyges' ring, or the ring perhaps mentioned in Lord of the Rings, the centerpiece really of that trilogy, what would you do with it? What would you be tempted to do? I always love to ask my students that question, and I try to probe my own thinking too on something like that. What would I do if I had a ring like that? And would, if I started out in baby steps, like for example, if I had an invisible ring and I was able to go somewhere and manipulate something invisibly, without detection, without the prospect of detection, so as, let us say, poor people on the street, people who are hungry and needed some extra cash, perhaps I could find some way of manipulating it so that those people could have access to funds. Now, obviously what I do there by the use of the ring is harm people who may have institutions or own them or be a part of them that are actually involved in money transaction. They don't know that I'm essentially taking money from them and giving it to the poor. Now, that does sound like a nice Robin Hood kind of valiant and virtuous thing to do when you think about it. But even that does have, according certainly to some moral codes of conduct, some unfortunate and untoward implications. Now, in the case of Gyges, it's certainly a self-serving activity that Gyges engages in. So he essentially can be read as indulging his own greed, has no fear of getting caught. He kills the king, seduces the king's wife, becomes king himself. Now, I think the details of the story probably therein lie the devil, figuratively speaking, because lies the devil, I should have said, because of the fact that it's a little bit difficult for us to maybe consider when we really think about how a queen, for example, the former king's wife, would have been presumably invisibly seduced, and perhaps to the point where she would have thought in a dark of night that it was actually her husband. He is able to get away, Gyges, with quite a bit when you think about it, killing the king, becoming the king himself. Now, what if he, you add a little bit of inflection, so to speak, moral inflection to this story, and it turns out that the king that he displaced, for all intents and purposes, immorally or illegitimately, by the use of his newfound power, was a tyrant and nasty, and Gyges becomes a benevolent tyrant, and perhaps even ushers in a what we think is of intrinsic value, democracy, to this imaginary kingdom. What happens then? So, again, if you take a look at utilitarianism, it might be that the greatest good for the greatest number was ultimately produced, and the self-serving abuse of the use of the ring was a good thing for Gyges himself, and possibly even the king's former wife, or the former king's wife, and society benefits. So, think about it for just a moment from that point of view. There's all sorts of convoluted ways of looking at this, but I suppose on the face of it, prima facie, we're talking about a moral character issue that somebody like Gyges has, but my guess is many of us would not be immune to the power of such a device. We'd be attracted to it. Of course, if you put this, cast it into modern life, and actually talk about what is mentioned in Poyman's book, the life of Jim versus the life of Jack, a kind of recast of the Gyges story. And that is, very briefly, to quote a little bit from your book, the story concerns two brothers, Jim and Jack. Jim, of course, was a splendid fellow, compassionate, possibly even, according to some descriptions, saintly, sacrificing for the poor, helping others. He might have even looked to be too good to be true. As a young man, he was framed by Jack for serious crime. He was in prison, constantly harassed, tortured by the guards and prisoners. Upon his release, he couldn't secure employment and was forced to beg for food. He lives a street person as a consequence of all of this in a large city in poor health, without a family, without shelter, no doubt without apparently even Social Security or Medicare. People avoid him whenever they can because he looks dangerous, yet in truth his heart is as pure as a driven snow. Now, if you can imagine a situation in which that has happened, where you know somebody who's basically pure, I know one or two people that are actually like that. That for if you take a look from the outside, they don't necessarily appear to be do-gooders, if you will. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, mind you. They may not appear to be virtuous, but after you get to know them for a bit and you talk to them, you realize that they've just been subject to some unfortunate circumstances, evidently, that have affected them in their development, in terms of their social progress, if you will. They don't have people I'm thinking of don't make good money. One in particular doesn't make any money at all. He's a middle-aged man still living with his elderly parents who are nearing the point at the end of their lives where no one knows what's going to happen. What's going to happen with him? He'll probably inherit something, maybe be able to get on with his life. He means well. He takes care of his parents. I mean, that's good. But on the other hand, when you think about what he ultimately does in a way of, I suppose, being what we ordinarily think of as a productive citizen, in our culture, he doesn't have a job. He had a relatively high-paying job maybe a decade ago or so, but made a series of mistakes and errors in judgment and sort of went through certain kinds of experiences. He's certainly not psychiatrically challenged, but he's one person I think of when I think to some extent of this story of Jim and Jack, even though he himself doesn't have a brother, let us say, like Jack. And let's talk about Jack for just a moment and try to put it in context. Jack is the older brother who actually framed his younger brother, Jim. And according to the story, is as evil as Jim is good. He's also, quote-unquote, successful in a way in which Jim is unsuccessful, just as I described this other real being I was talking about. He's not what we would call in society a successful human being. And, if you're thinking about relativism, you can kind of see that the notion of successful, according to some standards or some criteria, might be a kind of a relative term. What you think is successful, I don't think. But we do kind of have standards in our culture and society, which I think we should frequently question. And certainly, when we get into Aristotle a little bit more, we'll know that the successful life for Aristotle does have some objective criteria, and the person I'm referencing here, and probably Jim, the person referenced here in the story of Gyges, is not what you'd call successful either A, by modern standards, or B, by Aristotelian standards. Now, Jack, again, the one who's sort of inherently foul, is the embodiment of respectability and virtue. He's rising through the, according to the book, climbing the corporate ladder. He's an executive. Everybody loves him for his astuteness, his appearance. And you can think of people like this, can't you? Many of whom are celebrity types. And if not celebrities, they're people that often are in the news that I won't mention any names, but you can kind of think of some of them that you might have encountered frequently, that have all the external trappings of success. You have a suspicion maybe of them that they aren't necessarily quote-unquote good or virtuous people, but there is a degree to which they have used their native wit, intelligence, and capacities, personality, certain kinds of, I suppose, charisma, that has allowed them to become what we would call in our Western culture, certainly in a capitalist democracy, successful. Now, Aristotle might not agree with that, but we'll talk about that later. This gentleman, Jack, is married to the most beautiful woman in the community, and his children all go to the best private schools. Jack's wife is completely taken in by his performance. Okay, she knows him really well. Now, again, I'm thinking of some people recently in the news who probably had this kind of impression on people who were even their close loved ones, who, on analysis and in retrospect, it looks as though it might have been a bit of a dupe. That somebody was actually duped into thinking the person in question that they might have been married to all these years was completely faithful and virtuous. But in fact, there's a reading of that person's life that makes you believe that maybe that's not quite true. So this might not be, in other words, that far-fetched. Jack goes to church. He's on a board of directors of charity groups. He's even voted ideal citizen. Teachers use him as an example of how one can be both morally virtuous, so he's a good role model, morally virtuous, a good entrepreneur. That's what everybody wants to look like these days, I would say, particularly people running for office, mind you. Honored and admired by all. However, he's attained all of his success and wealth by ruthlessly destroying people who trusted him. He's actually an evil man. Now, again, I think it's probably inappropriate for any of us to look like we are judging other people without, in fact, sort of looking into our own lives and assuring that we are attempting our best to be fair. But if I generalize some of this a little bit, and you perhaps are able to fill in the missing names or blanks, you might see that this isn't so far-fetched. We have had reports, and if they're to be trusted, there were reports about people who appear to be magnanimous and possibly even give charitable causes. And let's say that they're corporations, not just persons we're talking about. So certain corporations do these kinds of things, and then they carry on and conduct their manufacturing business overseas, where typically in places like China and perhaps even Taiwan and perhaps Indonesia, these businesses manufacture typically electronic components and other things that, of course, we find ourselves using so much on a daily basis that we can't, we think, live without them. And in the course of creating factories overseas, needless to say, because of the slightly different kinds of employment standards and other expectations in some of these areas that used to be third world nations, people aren't getting paid nearly what the wage would be that would be expected of them if of the company, if indeed the manufacturing was to take place in some place like the United States. So the wages are maybe only 15%, if that, of what a person would typically make if they were manufacturing components, let's say, for elaborate technologies that are utilized worldwide. And the companies don't offer really good medical care. But the companies themselves, when you take a look at the profile and probably look at how much they might have actually committed to charitable causes, or maybe even the advertising of being quote-unquote green, which is quite in vogue at the time at which I narrate this. What does it mean to be green? Well, if you couple that with energy savings and supposedly a company that wishes to lessen its carbon footprint, and then you realize that in order for you to buy their products, the people that are manufacturing the products that you want to buy are not being paid too terribly much, not a livable wage, in some instances working 6 or 7 days a week. I'm trying not to exaggerate this. I'm sure that there are variant instantiations of this, so that you don't want to overgeneralize. But there we go. We have this situation in which, like this Jack, the older brother who does everything right and looks totally wonderfully beautiful to all of us, morally beautiful, in fact, does have some moral skeletons in his closet. And we may never find out anything about that, in which case I suppose the quote-unquote judgment that might be rendered on a life like that would have to be left to some higher source. So, should we choose the life of somebody like Jack, or a corporate life like I've just described? Or, in a Socratic way, would it not be proper to just remain virtuous even despite the fact that by outer appearances you have an unsuccessful life? This, of course, brings us ultimately to the concept of game theory. under morality, self-interest, and the notion of what it means to indulge in a game-theoretic interpretation of our behavior. Now, of course, there's a serious detail that can be made of this, and we should consider the beautiful mind concept, where one of the great contributions of the character that was in that particular movie was to game theory, economic game theory. So this can become highly mathematical. For our purposes, we just have to deal with a couple of different options and just cover the implications with respect to moral behavior and decision making. What does game theory actually do? How does it function with respect to our understanding of what it means to be an ethical behavior? Game theory presents situations in which players make decisions that will bring each of them the greatest benefit. These games then provide easy models for understanding more complex situations of social interaction in the real world. You've sometimes perhaps played games like Monopoly, in which if you have tried to achieve the level that you would need in order to be able to acquire property and houses and hotels and perhaps get the utilities and everything else, if you happen to be the banker, who knows what liberties you take with respect to how you actually are able to extract money from the great Monopoly kitty. But you'll know that the purpose behind Monopoly is basically to try to own as much as possible, and I suspect that if you ever do play the game Monopoly, you're terribly dissatisfied with yourself if you haven't acquired a whole lot of property. So that may in fact be a case in point, playing Monopoly, and then trying to figure out what the best situation is for you with respect to how it is that you should order your own particular thinking, and what principles you should abide by, and what understandings you have with regard to the other players that you're playing with. So with regard to what we call the famous prisoner's dilemma, it is this scenario. Let's take the following as a standard case. The secret police in another country have arrested two of our spies, Sam and Sue. Prior to being caught, Sam and Sue have agreed to keep silent during interrogation if they're ever arrested. So they have this mutual understanding between the two of them. Now that they are in the hands of the enemy, they both know that if they adhere to their agreement to keep silent, the police will be able to hold them for 4 months. So this is where they co-opt the idea of being silent about their mutual doings and activities. But if they violate their agreement and both confess that they are spies, they'll each get 6 years in prison, which doesn't seem to be a terribly desirable result. However, if one adheres and the other violates, the one who adheres will get 9 years, and the one who confesses will be let go immediately. So as we evaluate to some extent what either Sam should do or Sue does, we find that Sam will reason in this particular fashion. He'll say to himself that either Sue will adhere to the agreement or she'll violate it. If in fact Sue does adhere to that agreement, then it would seem obvious that Sam should violate it, because it's better for him to spend 0 time in prison than 4 months. On the other hand, as your book indicates, if Sue violates, then Sam should violate, because it's better for him to spend 6 years in prison than 9 years. Consequently, no matter what Sue does, it seems to be in Sam's best interest to violate their agreement. Now, if Sue reasons exactly the same way about Sam, she'll conclude that it's in her best interest to violate the agreement. But unfortunately, there's always a conundrum. If both Sam and Sue reason in this way, they will obtain what is called the second worst position with respect to the possible options with regard to the matrix, 6 years in prison each. That's a rather nasty consequence. If they ended up sticking to the original agreement, stay silent, they could do better. They'd only get 4 months. But since they can't get into each other's minds to see what the true intentions are, they're obviously unable to determine whether or not they can rely upon each other. So they're forced to look out for their own best interest, that is to say, to act prudentially, violate the original agreement, thus commit the moral infraction of, at the very least, violating a promise. So, on that view, it does seem to be the case that it's in one's best interest to cheat. Of course, you still have to consider the fact that you have to live with yourself when you make any of these decisions. In reality, our lives can be extremely complex, and that calls for a tremendous amount of insight to be brought into play. There are many other options besides the ones in reality that probably we want to consider if we're attempting to make a decision under circumstances similar to the ones that have been previously described. I suppose you might say that ultimately you have to live with your own conscience. And that then gets us into game number 2, whether or not we should cooperate or in fact cheat.